This video is a review of all of the energy pathways that produce ATP in the body. And we'll start here with our sprinter, who's in the starting blocks and is about to take off with an explosive start. When this runner jumps off the blocks to run at full speed, the very first thing that fuels that energy requirement is stored ATP. We don't store a lot of it because ATP is an incredibly heavy molecule, but there is just a small amount of ATP that's available to cover that very initial start to fuel the muscle requirements of that motor movement. But within a few seconds, we are going to need our first energy pathway to take over, and that is going to be the phosphagen system. The phosphagen system is incredibly fast. It's located out in the cytosol. We have creatine phosphate, or we could even take 2-ADP and move the phosphate group around in order to create ATP very quickly. So from here, we will pull off a little bit of ATP that will fuel approximately the next 10 seconds. But as that explosive start is now an all-out run into a 200-meter dash, we are going to need more energy than we can just get from the phosphagen system. Stored ATP and the phosphagen system gives you somewhere between 10 to 12 seconds of ATP. Our next pathway that was going to kick in will be glycolysis. Glycolysis again takes place out in the cytosol. On the scale of all of our energy pathways, it's relatively quick. It's not as fast as the phosphagen, which is a one-step reaction, because it does have 10 enzymes that take a glucose molecule and convert it to pyruvate. This conversion will pull some ATP off. So the action of glycolysis will create ATP. In fact, it'll keep this going for approximately another 2 minutes or so. 2 to 3 minutes, and we really are going to need more than just glycolysis to fuel. So if our runner kept going from a 200-meter dash to an 800-meter dash, and this runner needed about 4 to 5 minutes to complete that run, we're going to need more than just glycolysis. We're going to need the help of the aerobic pathways, which take place inside of the mitochondria. So inside of the cell, we have the organelle that is the mitochondria. The mitochondria has the inner mitochondrial membrane. And this pyruvate that we made in glycolysis can actually move into the mitochondria because we haven't gotten all of the energy out of that glucose molecule yet. There's still carbon bonds here that we can rip apart, rip electrons off, and get even more ATP. So when pyruvate moves into the mitochondria, it can be converted into acetyl-CoA. Now, acetyl-CoA can enter our third pathway, which is the TCA cycle, or Krebs cycle if you'd rather. The TCA cycle can take that acetyl-CoA as long as there is an oxaloacetate ready to join it, and this pathway can produce a very small amount of ATP. In fact, we only get 1 ATP molecule per turn of the TCA cycle. The big thing that we get from the TCA cycle and why it's such an important pathway before the electron transport chain is that it strips off electrons and sticks them onto carriers like NAD and FAD. NAD, without the hydrogen, is able to accept an electron, and the TCA cycle loads it up. So the TCA cycle is an oxidation reaction, allowing NAD to be reduced to NADH or FAD to be reduced to FADH2. Once we have those high energy electron carriers, they can be delivered to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is a group of proteins that throughout several protein complexes can pass the electron off, strip energy off, and ultimately make ATP. So the electron transport chain, these high energy electron carriers will drop their electrons off. And as long as there is an oxygen here available to accept that, ultimately being converted to water, the electron transport chain can run and use the energy of those electrons to produce massive amounts of ATP. We see those high energy electron carriers coming from more than just the TCA cycle. In fact, the conversion of glucose to pyruvate created a high energy electron carrier that could itself move in here, join the others, and jump into electron transport chain to be made into ATP. Now, if our runner had been going on the 800-meter dash and decided to just keep going, let's say they're going to keep running for 2 miles, we're going to need at least 20 minutes of sustained continuous activity. We've had enough time now that we could actually start freeing up some fat and use that to make ATP. Up to this point, we've been talking about how we've gotten energy from our stored phosphagen compounds, and we have energy from glucose. Our last pathway we're going to talk about is how we get energy out of fat, or triglycerides. And the very first thing that we have to do is we actually have to break that triglyceride apart into its glycerol backbone and its free fatty acid. Now, this glycerol backbone is just a simple 3-carbon molecule, and it can actually come over here, get converted into a GAP molecule, one of the molecules that's formed in glycolysis, and jump into glycolysis, and we can get ATP from that glycerol backbone. But that's not the main source of ATP from fat. The big store of fat is going to be the free fatty acid, and it will move into the mitochondria and be acted upon by beta oxidation. Beta oxidation is an oxidation reaction that strips carbon and electrons off of that free fatty acid. In fact, beta oxidation produces acetyl-CoA, the exact same acetyl-CoA that pyruvate was converted into. It pulls off these same high-energy electron carriers like NADH and FADH2 to enter the electron transport chain. This is looking at how all of these systems overlap and can be going on at the same time. If we go from start to finish, you can see that we initially rely on phosphagen for our explosion of energy in the beginning. Glycolysis is truly the pathway that fuels any transition from rest to activity and covers those first several minutes. But we really need to be able to have aerobic metabolism to be making enough ATP to sustain activity. If this individual had been running long enough that it had the time to free up fat, fat becomes a significant component of that ATP generation. At any point, however, if the rate of energy usage by the muscle exceeds the rate at which we can make ATP aerobically, and by that I mean the rate at which oxygen can show up here at the electron transport chain. If we need ATP faster than we can get oxygen delivered, we do have a backup system, and we can drive the anaerobic pathway. If we go back out into the cytosol, we can actually take this pyruvate and convert pyruvate to lactate. So in this case, instead of sending pyruvate into the mitochondria, we could convert it into lactate. And this does a very important thing for glycolysis. It replenishes an NAD, basically making that kind of an open truck capable of accepting electrons so that glycolysis can keep going. So if at any time we exceed the rate of oxygen delivery, we have this backup that we can rely on glycolysis anaerobically, because the formation of lactate will recycle our electron carriers, allowing for glycolysis to continue uninterrupted. I hope you find the summary helpful.